Roasting coffee at home is always fun and exciting, but sometimes it can be frustrating, especially when we get a coffee that we don't have a lot of information about. I had a coffee friend email me and say, "Hey, Mike, I've got an unknown coffee and I'm just wondering what might be the best approach to try to figure this out. I've only got a couple of batches worth roasting, so I want to get it right. So what do I do?" We're going to talk about that here today at the Virtual Coffee Lab, so stick around. All right, thanks for joining me today. Welcome to the Virtual Coffee Lab. Yeah, roasting coffee at home is a blast. It's a lot of fun, but there's challenges along the way. We've talked about those here in many of my videos. But receiving a coffee that doesn't have a lot of information is kind of dumbfounding. Other than the origin, and that's my coffee roasting friend said, "Hey, this is a Kenyan coffee," but that's all I know about it. He got his coffee from a roastery that was willing to sell him some fresh greens. I've encouraged that here on the channel with you, and it's a great opportunity to be able to get to know your local roastery, support them, and also have access to fresh greens that you may not be able to get through the mail order, through online services. So you should consider that, but occasionally you'll have issues where you've got this coffee and you don't know anything other than its origin. So I'm going to give you a few tips on ways to approach this coffee, things to consider so that you can get pretty close to having the information you need to get a decent roast. All right, first is bean size. Bean size plays a huge role in how we're going to approach this coffee and basically how much heat we're going to apply to this coffee. You can simply look and compare in size and see that some beans are much larger than others. You can have a very small bean, and because of both conductive heat transfer and convective heat transfer. So if you're using a drum roaster, the beans touching the drum wall, the beans touching each other, that is one method of heat transfer. So this heat will start to penetrate into the bean. The other is convective. Air roasters are primarily convective or convection type heating sources where air is blowing all around the bean and the heat is penetrating the bean. The smaller the bean, the quicker that heat will get to the center of the bean. And so that is something for you to consider as you are trying to figure out where to start with this bean, what temperatures to use. For an air roaster, you don't have a charge temperature. You have just heat being applied from the very beginning of the roast, and you've got room temperature roaster, room temperature beans, and you're starting from zero and basically going up, or starting from room temperature and headed on your way up. You're probably going to use a lower heat setting on your way up through the dry phase than you would on a larger bean. Now, the other aspect or the other point, the second point we're going to talk about is bean density, and that is going to also play a hand-in-hand role with the same effect as bean size. So we talk about bean density, we're talking about the hardness of the bean. There are beans that are grown at very high altitudes that are high density, very hard beans. Coffee is also grown at lower altitudes, and they are lower density, softer beans. The cellulose structure of the seed itself has more air pockets in a low density bean than a high density bean where the cellular structure is compressed or compact. So you'll need more heat to apply to a low density bean to get through the pockets of air to have that heat transfer to the center of the seed. The problem with that is that low density structure tends to be more susceptible to roasting defects. Roasting low density beans is a challenge because you're going to have to start out and use lower temperatures, and you're going to have to be very careful with you applying heat to these beans to prevent roasting defects. So bean density is going to play a role in how you approach this roast, how much heat you apply, especially at the beginning of the roast, how much energy as far as a charge goes, and then on your way up through the roasting process. So the question is, how do you determine the density of the bean? Well, you're going to measure that, and there's two ways that you can measure it as a home coffee roaster. One way is to literally measure it through weight. And I've got a video on how to do that. You should check this out. That is going to give you a numerical value, which will give you a range of density. It'll give you an idea if you've got a high density, a medium density, or a low density bean. Check that video out. The other way is, and these are clues, that you are probably dealing with a more dense bean, and that is looking at the line, the center line of the seed itself. If you have a very tight line, a very thin line, there's a good chance that that's a higher density bean compared to a wider line or a more open seed center line, and that would be tend to be more of a lower density bean. So watch the video on bean density. That will be really helpful. And you should also consider looking at the different beans that you have and compare. That's another way that you can do that, as a side-by-side comparison. So you have beans you've purchased from a source that provides data on those beans, the altitude. It may even mention a density on there, and you'll want to take a look at those and compare those to the seeds, the beans that you have, so that you can get a good idea of the type of density that you're dealing with. Another tip for roasting an unknown coffee is to look to see what type of processing is being used. How is this coffee processed once it was harvested? Is it a washed coffee? Is it a dry processed coffee or a natural? Is it a honey processed coffee? So look to see what type of coffee it is. How can you tell? Well, you can tell sometimes by smell. Sometimes you can get more of a real dark grassy note when you start to smell like a fresh washed coffee, or you can get a little more of a fruity note when you smell a dried processed or a natural coffee. Coffees that have mucilage left on them, a little bit of the fruit, those tend to smell a little more fruity. You can also look at the color of the beans and see if you see any mucilage or if you see any fruit that's still attached to the seed. You can see sometimes a yellow or a red or orangish hue on a natural or a dry process or a honey processed coffee, while a washed coffee is going to look like a pretty clean and pretty dark green olive colored bean with no real material attached to the bean itself. So why is the type of process something that we should be considering when we have an unknown coffee? Why does that make a difference? It makes a difference because when we apply heat to the beans, they behave differently in the roaster. I know this from personal experience. I've seen it happen with me where I am roasting a dried processed coffee and it seems as though it's more sensitive to heat. It takes on heat quicker. It moves through the dry process and the middle phase a lot quicker. And the next thing you know, you're treating it like a washed coffee and you've got a roast that's really flying too quickly. So take a close look at not only the bean size and measuring the density, but also take a look at the type of processing, because all three of these points so far are going to make a big difference in how you approach your coffee for charge and for how much heat you're going to apply and what you can expect to take place during the roast. All right, the last tip is batch size. Batch size plays a huge influence on how we roast our coffee, what temperatures we apply to our coffee. I'm going to give you an example. I roast a coffee for my church every week. It is a total of 700 grams of greens. But my 500 gram roaster doesn't have that capacity, so I split it into two roasts that are 350 grams of green coffee. After the moisture loss, when the roast is over with, I have the exact amount of coffee that I need for the coffee that we're going to be serving, that they serve at church. So you're going to want to be able to know how to adjust those temperatures for smaller batch sizes. Now, why are we talking about batch size for an unknown coffee? There could be a really good possibility that you've only been given a small amount to roast, and you're used to roasting a larger amount of that coffee. So you're going to have to make adjustments on how you're going to roast this coffee. You're going to have to adjust your heat. In my instance, with the smaller batch size, I am using a lower charge temperature and lower roasting temperatures than I normally would with a full capacity batch on my roaster. That is something that you should experiment with and see how it's influenced. For me, I target the same first crack time, I target the same end roasting time, and end roasting temperature is close to normal of what I would do, but you have to be very careful depending upon how small of a batch you have, because the probes don't always read the temperatures correctly when you have fewer beans hitting the probe if you're doing a really small batch. You need to be careful on, depending upon your roaster, what the smallest real batch size is that's going to allow you to still get good information through your probes if you're using probes. Okay, well, I've mentioned several points here that are really important for you, how to address unknown coffees. I'm sure there's other suggestions that you have, and I would encourage you to leave those suggestions as well. Something I may have missed that would be helpful for those that read these comments here. Also, as far as comments go, when you include your comments, if you have questions especially, be sure to mention the type of roaster you have and or the size of the roaster, and also include, if you're talking about specifics within the roast, talk about the type of coffee as well. That would be really helpful. That gives a little more context, a little more information. One thing about comments is that there's a lot of people that read these comments. The videos that I create, there's a term, it's called evergreen. These videos are evergreen videos, meaning that they are more or less, the content doesn't necessarily expire. It's content that's useful for a long time. And I have people that have watched videos that are 2 years old, and they're asking comments and I'm answering questions. So I would encourage you to look through the comments on my videos, because we're talking about things that I mentioned in my video. We're answering questions. Other people are also providing helpful information regarding that topic. And it is a huge resource, a really helpful resource. And I'm excited and I'm glad that it's available to you guys. So thanks for leaving your comments. Be sure to include relevant context when you're asking your questions. And look through the other videos that I've done and check those out. You might find some really helpful information, or you might provide more information that will help other home coffee roasters. All right, got some exciting news. Well, there's a gentleman by the name of Professor Steven Abbott. He is a scientist. He has worked with the Barista Hustle people, and I've got a link to the Barista Hustle website you should check out. But he's worked with them, and he's developed a virtual drum coffee roasting app. This app is geared towards both professional coffee roasters and home coffee roasters alike. So if you enjoy roasting coffee, you might like to try out the virtual roasting machine or the virtual coffee roasting drum app to see what's going on. You can create your own roast. You can see crashes, flicks, all of that take place when you make adjustments to the different variables. This app helps you better understand what's happening with the roasting process, and more importantly, the machine that you're using as you apply heat over time. The app's free, doesn't have any ads, and it is a resource that is really helpful that I would encourage you to give a try. There are 2 different versions of this app. The original version is designed for 1K coffee roasting drum machines and up. There is a smaller app, which I will have a link to both of these. The smaller app is designed to handle small roasters like the Bmore and roasters that are under 1K. There are some different variables, a few different variables on this small version compared to the original app. And then possibly in the future, there could be something specific towards air. That is something that we're talking about right now. There is a little bit of a learning curve to use the app, but it's pretty straightforward. Professor Steven Abbott has created a video to show you how to use the app, as well as a more or less a glossary of each of the fields and what they represent and how you should consider using those or setting those based on the type of roaster and the amount of energy that you have. So I would encourage you to check this app out. Again, it's free. It is in its very early stages of development. It is not perfect. Give it a try, use it, and place your comments and your questions here online on my channel on this specific video. And Professor Abbott will look at those and possibly answer those, and or you can email him directly, and I'll have his email address in the notes below as well, and that will get the conversation started. The purpose of all of this isn't to argue over what is right or what is wrong. It's to learn and to share information and learn about how these different elements, these different variables affect our roasting process. So I appreciate you watching this video. Thank you so much for being here today, and I hope that you guys have a great week roasting. We'll see you next time.